So welcome to the fourth discussion of the principles of democracies and why they fail. So I'm, again, happy to have any comments from last time. I'm going to start with sharing screen and just picking up one or 2 points about Aristotle before we make a venture into the sea change in all of philosophy and political philosophy in particular that occurs with the early modern or the early Enlightenment tradition, of which we are now the heirs. But I don't think we discussed in what I'll do for our last discussion next week. I'll try to produce in schematic form the principles and the principles of the failure of democracies for each of the thinkers that we're covering. But I just wanted to touch on this chapter that we didn't get a chance to look at, just what on Aristotle's analysis of why democracies fail. But I'll try to produce a discussion of why they all fail next week. And next week, I was anticipating doing some Nietzsche and then going to Strauss's essay. I think it might be safer just to go to Strauss's essay. I can point out one or two connections between modern thought and how it deteriorates into Nietzsche. But I think in order to have less text to focus on, we'll discuss, we'll focus on Strauss's essay and look across all of these different figures next week. So Aristotle has a fairly simple explanation for why democracies fail. It's because their leaders become demagogues who maintain their power through exploiting the rich or inciting the populace against the rich. Now, I don't know if this sounds at all familiar, but it's simple but effective technique. If you want to become a demagogue, obviously you have to do two things: point out that there are these people who have those things that we all want and need, and then you have to point out how you will take those things off them, and there you have it. You're in for the first term, and so that means that Aristotle's suggestions about why democracies don't fail has to do with the character, to use this word that's very, very old-fashioned, has to do with the virtue of both the populace and the leaders. And the modern critique of the ancients takes its bearing by that point. It thinks you're not going to get that many virtuous people. You're therefore not going to have a successful political community by appealing to people's aspirations to excellence or virtue, and you're not going to produce that many people by having an education in those things. The only way you're going to get a successful and lasting and stable political community is if you appeal to people's selfish passions. And you therefore you don't appeal to their moral reasoning. Reason instead becomes an instrument by which people satisfy their passions. And all you have to do is arrange the institutions in such a way that people acting for their own sake will affect the common good. So that's the cunning plan behind the enormous intricacy amongst the various schemata. Yeah, but was there anything on Aristotle that we discussed last week, or anything else we discussed thus far that anyone wanted to bring up?
Just it'll be interesting to see if the Treasurer applies Aristotle tonight. Yeah, most modern budgetary meetings are more or less clear proof of Aristotle's discussion. Yeah, the next step will be the universal basic income. That's where, and because so Aristotle is saying that what happens inevitably is that your democracy, so you think he's going to say, well, it becomes, as with Plato, a tyranny, or it becomes like a radical democracy in which people have direct participation and which there are no rich people anymore because we've taken excess wealth. But he doesn't say that. What he's saying is that you'll end up with an oligarchy, because the few who are very rich will combine to flatten everyone else. So instead of having, and he actually encourages, when he talks about the best practical regime, he encourages what he calls the middle element. We would say the middle class because we're slightly confused by the advent of Marxism. But the middle ground, the middle class, constitutes the best hope of the city because they have a major stake in it because they have some independence. And they also contribute a lot to it in terms of products and wealth and so on. And they express the main civic virtue of democracies, which is that they can fight, and they're willing to fight for the independence of their city, which is a theme, say, in Herodotus, in his history of the Persian Wars. Part of his theme is that the Greeks won because they were fighting for their own freedom, whereas the Persians, who were a multitude of slaves to the great king, were not in that position. Now, so I'm just going to briefly allude to Aristotle's teaching in order to set up the classical teaching that is the object of criticism of the moderns. And there are many different paths from Aristotle, Plato, and Xenophon through Christianity, Islam, Judaism, and I'm just picking out one because it's part of one of the main teachings in the Middle Ages of the West. So first of all, from the point of view of Plato and Aristotle, the point of political philosophy is to determine what is the best life and what is the best regime. That is, what is the most just regime. And the way Aristotle proceeds is not by looking at human beings like they're atoms and trying to understand the forces that you can then manipulate into a nice, stable system. He looks at it from within. What claim does each regime make for its excellence and its justice? And he finds things in both, as we saw in Book 3, Chapter 9. He finds elements in the claim that every regime makes that are partly true, but that point towards the actual truth, which is that the aim of the regime is the civic virtue of its citizens as the key to their happiness. So the end of the regime is the happiness and excellence of the people, of the citizens. And I reproduced that phrase from that chapter, that virtue must be a care for every city. And in that chapter, as we saw, he very carefully distinguishes between what he calls a city, properly speaking, a political community in which people have a care for one another's moral virtue, and various other kinds of communities, such as alliances or compacts for the prevention of injustice against one another. Now, that could be a definition of the modern notion of the political community stemming from Hobbes and Locke. And Rousseau finds that unsatisfactory and wants to rebuild the ancient city, but on the foundations laid by Hobbes and Locke. And what has spread from those three thinkers is our current confusion. So I just reproduce here a statement from Aquinas, which illustrates the problem that arises from classical political philosophy, which is, from their point of view, and from, I think, my point of view, it's an irresolvable problem. It's a fact of human life, but it does lead to difficulties that Hobbes immediately attacks. So this is Thomas Aquinas talking about law, and he's obviously in favor of people obeying the law as a decent principle of human practice. But it has a limit, because there is such a thing as unjust laws, in the same way Aristotle discusses in the beginning of Book 3, that the fundamental question is a good human being a good citizen? And our response is, well, you can be a good citizen of Stalin's Russia, Nazi Germany, but then are you a good human being? And Aristotle's answer, and our answer in most circumstances, is no. You could be a good citizen obeying the laws in certain regimes, but the regimes have such unjust convictions and laws that if you follow those laws, you're no longer an excellent human being. So this is a different expression of exactly the same thought by Aquinas. I'll read it and then discuss. So he says, wherefore the force of a law depends on the, this is a conclusion to an argument. The force of a law depends on the extent of its justice. Now, it's an assumption of our judicial system, of our Department of Justice, that the law can be identified with what is just, because that's what they're enforcing. But that, of course, is the problem, as I've just explained. So now in human affairs, a thing is said to be just from being right according to the rule of reason. But the first rule of reason is the law of nature, as is clear from what has been stated in the previous question. Consequently, every human law has just so much of the nature of law as it is derived from the law of nature. But if at any point it deflects from the law of nature, it is no longer a law, but a perversion of law. So on the one hand, there is a standard of justice by nature, in accord with the nature of human beings. A law that accords with that standard is genuinely a law. Otherwise, it's a perversion of law. That creates an immediate problem. You cannot teach the citizens of a political community to disobey the law if they think it's unjust. How fast do you think you were driving? Well, about 125 kilometers in a school zone, but I think that I am capable of driving safely at that speed, and I think the law is unjust. You can't teach people that the law is up to them. It has to be, every political community has to identify the law with justice itself, on the one hand, but on the other hand, we have in place all of these instruments, for example, judges, in order to try and take account of the fact that laws are often not just and need to be modified, reinterpreted, and we have a legislature that can bring in new laws to replace older laws, and so on. So that's a conundrum of human life that I don't think can be eliminated, and the attempt to eliminate it may produce greater problems than you begin with. That's a very broad suggestion, open to objection. But any question about what I'm suggesting? So in the classical tradition, expressed in various ways and interpreted in various ways, there is the following problem. There's one regime, the best regime that is in accord with human nature, that most develops the innate excellence and happiness of human beings. That means that all actual regimes are more or less unjust, but that's a problem, because that means that people can now question the regime, and Hobbes says that this leads to sedition or civil war, which means the destruction of the regime, which means the absence of law, and so the law has been undercut by the meddlesome political philosophers.
Don't people then go back and offer contrary views as to what the law of nature is? You know, Aristotle, we are a political animal. Hobbes denies it. So you just shift the point of debate, of conflict, further back up the line.
The point of him making this claim that human beings are not by nature political is to eliminate that difference. So we'll come to that shortly. Actually, I'll just yeah, that's because that's a key point, and we'll definitely be discussing it shortly. So this is Hobbes in a book that De Cive, which we're not reading, but so he is now expressing what I've just said that the classics teach in its most extreme form. And he says here, the third seditious doctrine sprung from the same root, which is classical political philosophy, is that tyrannicide is licit, permitted. In fact, certain theologians in our own day and all the sophists of the past, Plato, Aristotle, Cicero, Seneca, Plutarch, and the rest of the champions of anarchy in Greece and Rome, have supposed that it is not only licit, but deserves the highest praise. Now, from Plato and Aristotle's point of view, tyranny is the worst regime. A tyrannicide is a hero because they restore at least something better, right? Now, Hobbes is saying that means you all of you people, theologians and the philosophical tradition, which he here characterizes as sophists, all of them are anarchists because they are teaching that there is something you can appeal to above the law. And if you do that, then you're allowing people, you're encouraging people to say that they understand the standard above the law and they can break the law in light of that standard. And it might be worth having a brief look at a slightly more extensive expression of the same thought from the text that we are looking at now in chapter 21. I'm just going to find the page. Page 140. Actually, we're getting there. So I'll leave that for the moment. Okay, but does that point make sense that it's the accusation that Hobbes is making is not totally untrue. It's made in a rhetorical manner and he's dismissing the tradition as anarchy and so on. But it has some point to it that the tradition is supplying a standard above the law. Now, this means because there is this natural standard, and that standard has to do with the ends of life, what is by nature virtuous and what is by nature noble, that results in sedition and conflict when you have competing teachings about what the best way of life is. So he thinks that the following thing has happened. The classics have reproduced a specious understanding of freedom, as opposed to the notion of freedom that he is going to offer, which is that by nature, we are absolutely free, and that freedom is fundamental, and that freedom is limited by the contract that we enter into with our fellow citizens, by which we all give our power to the sovereign. And then the sovereign makes laws that limit what we can do, but we have no appeal above the sovereign. Now, I just want to read it. Well, we can look at it together on page 140 of the Hobbes handout. Just some explanation of this criticism. So, paragraph 9 of chapter 21. But it's an easy thing for men to be deceived by the specious name of liberty, the fake name of liberty, and for want of judgment to distinguish, mistake that for their private inheritance and birthright, which is the right of the public only. That is, he's saying, people take it that you have a right to do what you want in your own life. That's freedom. And he's saying, no, the public, the sovereign has the right to act freely, right? Because you've given up your freedom. But when the same error is confirmed by the authority of men in reputation for their writings in this subject, it is no wonder if it produce sedition and change of government. In these western parts of the world, we are made to receive our opinions concerning the institution and rights of commonwealths from Aristotle, Cicero, and other men, Greeks and Romans, that living under popular states derive those rights not from the principles of nature, as Hobbes claims he is doing for the first time properly, but transcribe them into their books out of the practice of their own commonwealths, which were popular, that is, democratic, as the grammarians describe the rules of language out of the practice of the time, or the rules of poetry out of the poems of Homer and Virgil. Now, this claim is not insane because grammar was only developed after the Greeks, specifically after Plato's Sophist, basically, where he makes the first distinction between noun and verb, object, subject, and predicate. And the grammatic tradition was invented by people who were becoming aware that they no longer knew Greek, and then moved into Latin. And then the first English grammar books were written as if English was Latin. So he's making a point that, yeah, people are moved by the originating opinions of a discipline. Just as, for example, in tragedy, there were supposedly rules apparently derived from Aristotle, then applied to tragedy in the 16th and 17th century, which also seem to be out of place. So he's saying it's the same with the ancient Greek and Roman political philosophers, because they lived under popular or democratic states or republics. They falsely applied the principles of their states as if that applied to every state. Now, that's also quite odd, because Aristotle wrote after the state was dead as a political community, the polis. Alexander had already conquered the world, and there were no longer independent political communities that the way they were in the 5th century. But in any case, that's his claim. So, and because the Athenians were taught to keep them from desire of changing their government, that they were free men, and all that lived under monarchy were slaves, therefore Aristotle puts it down in his Politics: in democracy, liberty is to be supposed, for it is commonly held that no man is free in any other government. And the footnote, the learned footnote from it's Curley, Edwin Curley, is that Aristotle is quoting what other people quote, and that's quite correct. It's a common saying: you're not free unless you're in a democracy. But in any case, the idea that Aristotle is repeating that as his own teaching is laughable. And as Aristotle, so Cicero and other writers have grounded their civil doctrine on the opinions of the Romans, who were taught to hate monarchy, at first by them having deposed their sovereign, shared amongst the sovereignty of Rome, and afterward by their successors. And by reading of these Greek and Latin authors, men from their childhood have gotten a habit, under a false show of liberty, of favouring tumults and licentious controlling the actions of their sovereigns, and again of controlling those controllers, with the effusion of so much blood, as I think I may truly say, there was never anything so dearly bought as these Western parts have bought the learning of the Greek and Latin tongues. Now, he's obviously writing in a time where we've had the Reformation, religious wars, and the revolution in England, and there was an enormous amount of blood spilt in the century preceding this document. How much of it is to be put to this one particular point about the teaching of the political philosophers is debatable, but when you see the way he combines theology and political philosophy in De Cive, there were teachings that taught differently about the highest end of human beings, which transcended the political community, which caused sedition within those political communities and between those political communities. And that's what he's pointing at. And he wants to resolve that problem. There will be no sedition, no justifiable sedition, because he's going to teach that the law must be obeyed and there's no appeal above it. That's the basically. Now, immediately he has to make qualifications and exceptions, and we'll come to that. But he wants to radically reframe our understanding of human nature so that when we enter into a political community that has laws, those laws are absolute. So that's the intention. Okay, so I'll come back to this second paragraph here. The focus on the ends, that is the trans-political ends of life, has led to political conflict. Now, if we replace that species freedom that the classics appear to teach in Hobbes's eye, with a notion that our freedom is limited, and we replace that notion of the end with the means to life, then we have a motivation by which people can be made to enter into the social contract. Okay, but the chapter I want to read is chapter 13. We're doing the best hits and greatest memories of the Leviathan. So we're reading chapter 13, and we will discuss in detail his change in the understanding of human nature. And I'm just going to go through some further broader points, and then we'll look at some text and details. But yeah, any questions thus far, or? Now, to read these texts, we need to understand the rhetorical strategy of the authors of this time, Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau. If you look at one of the last chapters of the Leviathan, it's called On the Kingdom of Darkness. And he means the people, that is the philosophers and theologians who have kept us in darkness. Hobbes, Locke, Bacon, Descartes, they are all waging consciously a war against what they take to be the principles of darkness. And they will bring in principles of enlightenment. Now, to do that, if you're going to undercut the tradition, you have to make it not noticeable that you were undercutting, you have to be persuasive. So you have to appeal to some aspects of the tradition as you are undercutting it. Otherwise, you'll be rejected out of hand. And there's just a very good example of that in the approaches to Locke's treatise. So Locke wrote 2 treatises on government, and the first one is a critique of an orthodox author. Let's come to the text. Sir Robert Filmer. And I think I've just selected 3 sections out of this first book, and the second book on government is the one that has the main details we are interested in. But this one gives you an idea of how you are to conduct your rhetoric when you're trying to compel a regime change. So the beginning of the book is as follows. Slavery is so vile and miserable an estate of man, and so directly opposite to the generous temper and courage of our nation, that it is hardly to be conceived that an Englishman, much less a gentleman, should plead for it. So he's saying that Filmer, in his book Patriarcha, is essentially making slaves of citizens, slaves to the monarch, because he's making a divine right of kings argument. And truly, I should have taken Sir Robert Filmer's Patriarcha as any other treatise, which would persuade all men that they are slaves, and ought to be so, for such an exercise of wit as was his who writ the encomium of Nero, rather than for a serious discourse meant in earnest, had not the gravity of the title and epistle, the picture in the front of the book, and the applause that followed it, required me to believe that the author and publisher were both in earnest. So Locke here adopts the position of an inheritor of the British tradition of freedom, against which he takes exception to this theoretical work. But he's going to reject the theoretical the traditional understanding of the rights of Englishmen. He's going to reject that for an entirely new basis and a philosophical basis, an argument about human nature. Second, section 58, thus far can the busy mind of man carry him to a brutality below the level of beasts when he quits his reason, which places him almost equal to angels. Nor can it be otherwise in a creature whose thoughts are more than the sands and wider than the ocean, where fancy and passion must needs run him into strange courses, if reason, which is his only star and compass, be not that he steers by. Now, here he appears to be appealing to the tradition of philosophy, but more the tradition of theology, which interpreted the philosophical argument about human nature and about the species-specific abilities of beings into the rank order of inanimate things, animals, men, angels, God. And you can see there's a brief example of that in Thomas Aquinas's On Being in Essence, if you would like to see an example. Now, that appears to be an appeal to the traditional understanding, which in radically different ways is shared by Aquinas and Aristotle and many people in between, that the human being is characterized by reason. That's our species-specific capacity, the actualization of which is our excellence and happiness. But he's also indicating that he's radically changing that, because we are led by fashion and, not by fashion and pants, but fancy and passion. So we are led by the imagination and the desires, and reason is the instrument to steer the desires. Reason doesn't give us the end. And that's a radical change. That's a rejection of the tradition. So same as section 1. So he appeals to the British tradition, the philosophical and theological traditions, only to reject them. And then we see more of that in this section 86. So, but not to follow our author too far out of the way, the plain of the case, that is, the plain matter of the case is this: God, having made man and planted in him, as in all other animals, a strong desire of self-preservation, and furnished the world with things fit for food and raiment, clothing, and other necessaries of life, subservient to his design, that man should live and abide for some time upon the face of the earth, and not that so curious and wonderful a piece of workmanship, by his own negligence or want of necessaries, should perish again, presently, after a few moments of continuance. God, I say, having made man and the world thus, spoke to him, that is, directed him by his senses and reason. Okay, so that's a slight shift. So there's no actual, revelation of the word of God. There's just, because he's assuming the traditional teaching of the time, which is that human beings are created by God with sense and reason. And he's saying that's the voice of God. So we don't need exterior things like Bibles and so forth. Okay, directed him by his sense and reason, as he did the inferior animals by their sense and instinct, which were serviceable for his subsistence and given as the means of his preservation. So that which makes us human beings, our sense and reason, is the instrument of our preservation, right? It's not the expression of our kind. It's not a unique human ability. And therefore I doubt not, but before these words were pronounced in Genesis chapters 28 and 29, if they must be understood literally to have been spoken, because I've just shown, Locke is implying, I've just shown that they are not literally spoken, that whatever our sense and reason comes up with, you can take that for the law of nature, the divine law. And without any such verbal donation, man had a right to an use of the creatures by the will and grant of God, for the desire, strong desire, of preserving his life and being, having been planted in him as a principle of action by God himself. Reason, which was the voice of God in him, could not but teach him and assure him that pursuing that natural inclination, he had to preserve his being, he followed the will of his maker, and therefore had a right to make use of those creatures which by his reason or senses, which is the new definition of the voice of God, he could discover would be serviceable thereunto. And thus man's property in the creatures was founded upon the right he had to make use of those things that were necessary or useful to his being. And Locke is going to make an argument about property that we'll look at shortly. Now, but what he's saying is that what we are essentially is an animal that wants to preserve itself. Unlike the other animals, we have reason, which means we have the best possible instrument for the preservation of ourselves. This is worth, to understand what's happening at this point in history, it's worth, say, looking at what Aquinas says on self-preservation. I forget the question number now, but he says, on the lowest level, there's the preservation of the body, and then there's preservation through political means and education. And then at the highest level for him, it's participation in the divine. And so, but he calls that preservation. And so Locke is saying all of those things, Locke is saying all of those things are false. The only true one is self-preservation of the body. But the reason why I read these excerpts is just to show you that this is, it's a very intricate rhetorical device. On the one hand, he appears to be appealing to the two mainsprings of political thought at the time, and while at the same time replacing them. Back to the handout first. So that's my suggestion about the rhetorical character of these works. Naturally, all works of philosophy have a rhetorical character, and Plato's and Aristotle's as much as anyone, if not more. Now, I just summarize some basic points here, which maybe I'll go through those and then we can then look at Hobbes in more detail. So Hobbes does not advocate for a democracy. It's indifferent to him who the sovereign is. It's one person or many people, but he makes the decisive move for modern political philosophy, which is that he makes our rights the fundamental thing, and then any duty we have is secondary or derivative, but the basic thing is right and freedom. And that lays the foundation for modern democracy, which is built on the notion of human rights. I wonder if we should look at something now. Yeah, no, we'll look in detail shortly. So human beings have the natural right to do anything to preserve themselves, including a right to anyone's possessions or body. So there's no justice by nature. There is no such thing as justice. There is no law of nature. There's no natural right, none of that. All of that is only brought into being with the social contract. So by nature, you can do anything, no matter how bizarre, depraved, or foolish that you think that you want to do to either preserve your body or to make life not worth living. He has a very good negative phrase, to prevent life from being unbearable. He has another way of saying it. I'll try to pick it out. Okay, so the fundamental right, therefore, is freedom, and therefore by nature we are free. Reason is an instrument which shows us the best way to satisfy our main passion, which is fear of violent death. Because given that everyone has a right to anything and can do whatever they like if they think it's necessary to their life, we are therefore by nature in a war of all against all. And our reason shows us the way out of that danger, which is to make a contract with others to give up our right to harm anyone, and they will give up their right to harm us, and we will have a set of laws that protects all of our rights, but there must be someone above that contract who can enforce it, and that's the sovereign. If it's one person, it's a monarch. If it's more, it's a democracy. And what Hobbes says that if you make the distinction between king and tyrant, the way Aristotle does, the good regimes are king, aristocracy, and republic. The bad ones are tyranny, oligarchy, and mob rule, or democratia. That distinction is false. Whoever has the power to make laws for a community is equally the sovereign. And if you call one a tyrant, it's just because you don't like them. It's just your personal preference. And you have no right to appeal above the law. Okay, so Hobbes does not therefore directly express a preference for democracy, but he lays the ground for it by attempting to argue that right is fundamental and any kind of duty is derivative. So Locke does provide the basis for liberal democracy and representative democracy. He accepts Hobbes's discussion of the state of nature. Initially, if you read the second treatise on government, the first few sections appear to make it seem as if by nature we live in a kind of paradise. There's more than enough for all, he says over and over again. More than enough by nature for all. But by section about 123, he is saying we have to give up the state of nature because we are in fear of violent death. So I would take this to be rhetorical. He's presenting a much gentler seeming case for Hobbes's discussion of the state of nature, but he accepts that discussion. There are differences though, because he also says that we do not, if we're giving up our rights in the state of nature to the sovereign, and we give that up to a sovereign who is above the law, then we're giving up our rights in order to lose them. And that makes no sense. We must give up our rights equally to one another, and therefore that a representative democracy is the most just kind of regime. So he rejects that aspect of Hobbes. The sovereign can't be above the law. And he also makes this other argument in chapter 5 of the second treatise on government, which is the central chapter, and in many ways the most important, which is that there can be a right to property prior to the social contract. Whereas Hobbes is saying that prior to the social contract, there's no just and unjust. Locke is arguing that there is in fact a way that you can legitimately own something. You can't protect it because you can be overwhelmed by the physical force of other people. And that's why we enter the state of the social contract. But there is a standard of the right to property. And that's important because it ends up being a right. He says in section 50 of this text that we are assenting, that we all have already assented to a disproportionate ownership of wealth. And I'll attempt to elucidate how he makes that argument. But that chapter 5 becomes really the basis for later economic thought, like Adam Smith and so on. Okay, the third classic social contract thinker is Rousseau. And I say he radicalizes the modern teaching because he takes it to the root. If human beings are by nature apolitical or pre-political or asocial, then by nature, we do not have reason and we do not have language. These things come with society. Now that means there's now a much greater distance between our nature and what we are in society. And Rousseau, amongst the many things he discusses in a very full literary career, is that human beings in bourgeois society, in the kind of society that we get after Locke, are always going to be in tension between their own self-interest and the interest of everyone else. And so they'll be characterized by hypocrisy. Hence 8,000 novels about bourgeois moral hypocrisy after Rousseau. And another point he makes is that he suggests that the only genuine social bond is that between mother and child. Now, if the family is the basic element of society, you have to rebuild that bond, and that is why what we now call the novel, the romance, has been such a central form of literature since Rousseau, because the choice of two people to fall in love and marry one another becomes the central political act, and it must be elaborated and made beautiful by the novel. And of the first couple of which Rousseau wrote on this particular topic. Now, those are the sort of supra-political things. The political thing, which we get in the social contract, is this. By nature, we're all free and equal, and that's not the state in any particular society where there are class systems and so forth. And so if you want a slightly pessimistic expression of what his political teaching is about, we'll go to his first aphorism. I want to inquire whether in the civil order there can be some legitimate and sure rule of administration, which is, the same as Plato. What are the legitimate principles of government? He said, and then Rousseau goes on, taking men as they are and the laws as they can be. In this inquiry, I shall try always to combine what right permits with what interest prescribes, so that justice and utility may not be disjoined. That's an expression of the entire aim of political philosophy. How do we unite self-interest and justice? Now, he begins his book with the next aphorism. Man is born free, and everywhere he is in chains. One believes himself the other's master, and yet is more a slave than they. How did this change come about from our original natural freedom? I do not know. what can make it legitimate? I believe I can solve this question. So what can make the chains legitimate? So if you have a pessimistic presentiment about the likelihood of justified chains, I think that's justified. But he's going to argue as follows: we're free and equal in the state of nature, and we have no bond. The only possible society that would replicate that equality and freedom is one in which we have a free and equal part. That is, we have an equal voice in the community that forms the principles and laws of the community. And the ideal is the small, political community, like the city-states of the Greeks, or like the cantons of Switzerland, where 5,000 people vote on any particular issue. And that agreement, because everyone has an equal voice in the argument, they must abide by the consensus that is formed, for which he has the term general will. Now, there is no standard outside that general will, just as with Hobbes. There's no standard outside the law by which to judge the law. There's no standard outside the general will by which to judge it. And that means that the general will of a political community is not the object of reason and invention, and therefore it's not the object of a founder who understands human nature and constructs the institutions of a city. Instead, it's this organic growth. And we eventually come to use this word culture as opposed to political community. And Kant uses culture for the first time. That's because he is directly a student of Rousseau in political philosophy. Right, that's the brief overview. Any questions thus far as we stride briskly through hundreds of years of?
Yeah, Martin, just the term reason and the meaning of reason is really a very interesting thing, and that's been a continuous thing in your courses over time, and it really is a kind of, it really is, some people might say it's a kind of sharpening or focusing of reason, that it becomes instrumental to the basic goals. But of course, in another way, if it is something pretty universal and defining of what the species is, then it's really a reduction, isn't it?
Yes. It's odd that the non-reductive thought of Plato and Aristotle is that the highest development of our faculties is that by which we should orientate ourselves. And that gives you this very odd picture. So for Plato, all of these highly developed and intricate political discussions in the laws and the Republic, but somehow Socrates is the highest figure. And that must be somehow kept in mind when we're discussing political things, that Socrates does not pretend and does not want to directly influence. Now, if you say, well, look, if you follow Bacon and say that the classics orientate themselves by the stars that are so distant that they give no light and warmth, and say, let's be realistic, or like Machiavelli, I'm going to teach something that is useful for people who want to learn how human beings are, not how they ought to be. So the first step is, well, that elitist notion of what a fully developed human being is, we can ignore that for political purposes. Let's just focus on what most people are, which is they desire money, glory, and power. And then the only argument is, well, is it better to have a democracy or a principality? And the greater good is that we have a republic, but it has that reductive effect, because if you take away the aspect of reason that is non-instrumental, then you are left with not specifically human desires, mean, animals have spiritedness to an extent, and they obviously have bodily desires. And so therefore you're saying that human beings are extremely clever animals. And that may have helpful results in the production of wheat, but it has unhelpful results in the whole orientation of your culture. Because human beings, if the classics are right, and I think this point is right, we always orientate ourselves by the best form of something. And none of us are perfect, and without that orientation, we won't produce that little that is good that we do produce. Okay, I promise never to deliver a sermon like that again. Okay, so let's get back. I just put into a chart some of the central differences. We're getting closer to having a break, so I'll just run through a couple of these, just because I thought that they it might make it easier to picture the difference between the two. So, is there a general and or natural inclination of all human beings? And this will bring out the point about reason that Chris was making. So let's look at what Hobbes says. So for Aristotle, our end is happiness. We achieve that end through virtue, moral virtue or civil virtue and intellectual virtue. That leads to all kinds of problems about private and public and so on, but essentially we are characterized by our capacity, our possession of logos, of speech and reason. And our reason has either practical or theoretical purposes. And our happiness is achieved through the actualization of that capacity. Contrast that with Hobbes. And he's directly criticizing Aristotle and others here. So by manners, he means morals. I mean, the way of life, the mores of a person. By manners, I mean not here decency of behavior as how one man should salute another, or how a man should wash his mouth or pick his teeth before company, and such other points of the small morals, but those qualities of mankind that concern their living together in peace and unity. Now, that's already a restriction. For the moderns, moral excellence is the qualities that allow you to live with others. That is, morality is for the sake of society. It's the reverse in Aristotle. Society is for the sake of your having excellences of character and mind that make you happy, that are instances of human excellence. So there's a reversal there. But anyway, so other points of blah, blah, blah. But those qualities of mankind that concern their living together in peace and unity, to which end we are to consider that the felicity, the happiness of this life consisteth not in the repose of a mind satisfied. For there is no such finis ultimus, utmost aim, nor summum bonum, greatest good, as is spoken of in the books of the old moral philosophers. Nor can a man any more live whose desires are at an end. Now, I don't know who said that. I don't know who he's pretending to argue against, but than he whose senses and imaginations are at an end. Felicity is a continual progress of the desire from one object to the other, the attaining of the former being still but the way to the latter. So attaining a desire is not a satisfaction. It's just a means to the next desire. What's the cause of this odd situation? The cause whereof is that the object of man's desire is not to enjoy once only and for one instant of time, but to assure forever the way of his future desire. So what we really desire is not the actual things we aim at, it's the power to ensure that we can have what we want in the future. And therefore the voluntary actions and inclinations of all men tend not only to the procuring, but also to the assuring of a contented life, and differ only in the way, right? So human beings don't differ fundamentally in their ends, which is what Aristotle would say. Some people are just, some noble, some unjust, some ignoble, some courageous, some cowardly, and so on. That's not important for Hobbes. what matters is the way in which they try to achieve whatever end they have, which arise if partly from the diversity of passions in diverse men's. So the ends are set by the passions, not by reason, and partly from the difference of the knowledge or opinion each has of the causes which produces the effect desires. That is, reason is a capacity to understand what cause produces what effect. So if we desire because of our passions, not because of our reason, if we desire a certain effect, we then have the reason to bring about that effect. Now, this is the fundamental statement. So that in the first place, I put for a general inclination of all mankind a perpetual and restless desire of power after power that ceases only in death. Now, he then goes on to explain that, just in case you've missed the point, I do not mean that there is any particular end whatsoever, not even just pleasure. So you desire the power to ensure you'll have pleasure, you don't desire pleasure. He says, and the cause of this is not always that a man hopes for a more intensive delight than he has already attained to, or that he cannot be content with a moderate power, but because he cannot assure the power and means to live well, which he hath present, without the acquisition of more. So then he gives an example. So that's why kings, even when they have great power, turn their endeavors to assuring it at home by laws or abroad by wars. And when that's done, there succeeds a new desire, in some of fame from new conquest, in others of ease and sensual pleasure, in others of admiration or being flattered for excellence in some art or other ability of mind, and so on. So there are no ends. The end is power. And so life
is Hobbes' use of the word power the same as, in sort of neo-Marxism and modern, identity politics and all the rest of it?
There is a line between Hobbes and Rousseau, and Nietzsche, who says
a connecting line or a dividing line?
No, a line, a connecting line.
Right.
It curls around and it branches out into a few flowers in the period of German idealism, but then goes straight to Nietzsche, and it is as follows. If you're Hobbes, Descartes, Bacon, like Bacon says, the point of philosophy, that is thought at its highest, and by philosophy he means science, modern science, what we now call modern science as well as philosophy as a whole, is to give human beings power over nature, give us empire over nature. So that's power, not particular ends, not particular excellences. So the excellence of a human being for Bacon is that your use of your power gives you glory and brings material benefits to the rest of humankind, similar to Hobbes. But they both share, there's no end of human nature that is characteristic of our species, as for example, the development of our reason, capacity for the appreciation of beauty, and so on. And so if that now, Bacon and Descartes and Hobbes and Locke are arguing that we can direct our reason to a reasonable use of our power, so that we have commodious homes, we have plenty of food, cities have plumbing, and so forth. But once you've said that power is the end, you're therefore implying that your notion of what that end is merely rhetorical. You have no reason for it. So Hobbes' argument that the end is avoidance of violent death has no more rational ground than Nietzsche's argument that the end is the noble expression of the will to power, first of all in literature and then in politics. So, and Nietzsche exposes this problem and makes it explicit that power is not just the basis of human nature, but that of nature as a whole. And that becomes the keynote to what we now call postmodernism, which is usually the reduction of whatever it is, whatever.
Won't be a moment.
whatever phenomena we have to ultimately power. And so that's why we talk about structures of power and various classes and ethnicities that profit from that structure and so on.
Just a quick question, Martin. So as best I can tell, some of these characters, the moderns, were very, very well versed in the classical literature. And they and at the time they were living, you know, between the 15th and the 17th or 18th century, there were other people who were not reading the classicists, the classics in these ways. So I wonder how we account for it, given that there were obviously people who were not reading it in this reductive way, how Hobbes and Bacon and so on came to prevail.
How they came to prevail, or why they read it differently from other people at the time? Because there were others at the time who took themselves to be replicating, continuing the tradition, say, of Plato and Aristotle. So why they prevail? Well,
yeah, that's what I meant. Sorry. Yeah.
Yeah. So the basic reason is because they made an appeal to very powerful passions and showed the way to the satisfaction of those passions. And the only condition of the contract, this is not the social contract, this is the completely radically new contract between philosophy or science and society, which is a very different subterranean thing, but of enormous importance for our epoch. There's a new contract between the philosopher and political power, which is that you will recognize and respect science and philosophy, and we will provide you with the conveniences of life. And that proved to be enormously attractive, first of all, to the rulers. And that's why the great Enlightenment rulers were people like Frederick II and the kings of various principalities in Germany, who encouraged this thought because it gave them more power, made them more prosperous. Now, the great other example is the United States founding itself explicitly on the principles of Locke, and a few other people, Montesquieu and so on, who has a similar teaching. And the United States became, until 20 years ago, it was the most powerful nation on earth for over a century. Yeah, so what we saw with Aristotle, and what I tried to suggest this earlier when I talked about how Locke arranges his rhetoric. I'm sorry, we've gone very late. We should have a break. So I'll just say this one thing and then we'll stop. Aristotle is appealing to lawmakers and founders of cities to say, this is your first concern, the practical and intellectual excellence of the people for whom you are making laws. And the moderns say, well, this is why, A, you haven't succeeded. We have continuous wars, civil wars, religious wars, and bloodshed. What we need are the conditions of life that make any kind of life possible. And then we can discuss about how to live. First, we want peace, right? And second, you haven't made philosophy or science itself respectable. Galileo is silenced, and that's the same as Anaxagoras being tried for impiety in Athens. So we can solve both those problems by changing the character of society and changing the character of philosophy, but only by making the strongest possible appeal to what society as a whole wants: the convenience of life, pleasure, security, and fundamentally security. So we should have a break. We'll come back at 7:20 then. Great, thank you. So first thing, chapter 13 of the Leviathan by Hobbes. And along with what we read in chapter 9, so happiness is not what the philosophical tradition has said it is. It's actually the desire for power. And that means human nature is different, and we are not by nature, if our desire for power is the fundamental, we're not by nature made for community. And then, so this chapter is of equal importance, and it's probably his most famous writing, chapter 13, of the natural condition of mankind as concerning their felicity or happiness and misery. Now, first paragraph, Hobbes has a very good sense of humor, as you'll find the more you read him. Nature hath made men so equal in the faculties of body and mind, as that, though there be found one man, sometimes manifestly stronger in body or of quicker mind than another, yet when all is reckoned together, the difference between man and man is not so considerable as that one man can therefore claim to himself any benefit to which another may not pretend, as well as he. So, different procedure from Aristotle, who in that chapter 9 of book 3 that we read, he is evaluating the different claims of what justice is by democracy and oligarchy. And they both claim that they provide something good, human beings who are free or human beings who are wealthy. And he says there's something to both of these. Equal should be for equals and unequal should be for unequals. But the fundamental criteria is not wealth. It's excellence or virtue. And that has a political claim. And this is the denial of that. There is no claim that anyone can make on anyone else that is politically relevant. Okay. For as to the strength of body, the weakest has strength enough to kill the strongest, either by secret machination or by confederacy with others that are in the same danger with himself. So we're equal in body and soul. We're equal in body because we can kill each other. Okay, so we're equal in our vulnerability, basically. I find that quite amusing. Anyway, as to the faculties of the mind, setting aside the arts grounded upon words, and especially that skill of proceeding upon general and infallible rules called science. So setting aside what I do, which very few have, and but in few things, setting aside that as being not a native faculty, that's not a, so science is not the perfection of our nature. It's merely a highly powerful instrument, right? Anyway, so nor attained as prudence while we look after somewhat else. So in Aristotle, we have theoretical and practical intellectual capabilities, prudence, right? And nous or Sophia. And he is denying that these things distinguish us in any relevant manner. And he's denying that prudence is a faculty that some people possess to the highest degree. Say, compare a Churchill to anyone now, right? Like that's a high degree of practical intelligence. And he's denying that has a natural foundation. It's merely the result of experience. So he says, I find yet a greater equality among men than that of strength. Okay, for prudence is but experience, that is, prudence is nothing but experience, which equal time equally bestows on all men in those things they equally apply themselves unto. I find that incredible, but we go on. That which may perhaps make such equality incredible, which it does seem to be to me, is but a vain conceit of one's own wisdom, which almost all men think they have in a greater degree than the vulgar. So by my saying I find that sentence incredible, I'm merely expressing the vain thought that I am among the few who are prudent by nature and not the many, which is a delusion of my vanity. That is, then all men but themselves and a few others, by fame or for concurring with themselves, they approve. For such is the nature of men, that howsoever they may acknowledge many others to be more witty or more eloquent or more learned, yet they will hardly believe there be many so wise as themselves, for they see their own wit at hand and other men's at a distance. Now, so first point is any pretension to, superior prudence to other human beings is vanity and false. It's merely the result of experience in a certain area. But now comes the main part. But on the other hand, everyone thinks that they're wiser. Okay, for they see that because we see our own intelligence up close and we see others at a distance. But this proves rather that men are in that point equal than unequal. For there is not ordinarily a greater sign of the equal distribution of anything than that every man is contented with his share. It's a very amusing remark. So what he's saying is, I find even greater equality in prudence. Why? Because everyone equally and wrongly thinks that they're wise. And if people are equally contented with their share, that means they got an equal amount. But no, what they have is an equal amount of vanity. It's a little joke that he shares with Descartes. If you read the first couple of paragraphs of the Discourse on Method, Descartes makes the same joke as part of the justification for writing a discourse on method, because our minds are all the same. What differentiates us is the method, and what we need is a universal method. And that's a typical modern book. Descartes writes a discourse on method. Locke writes a book on the method of directing the mind. Spinoza writes a book on the method of directing the mind, and so on. And now we talk about scientific methodology. What we want is a method, a universal method, and that's a consequence of the assumption that there is no comprehensive wisdom that we can attain to.
Can I ask a question here? When the classical authors say that the highest thing for a human being, is the most acute seeing of eternal things, philosophical insight, is that in any way a kind of power, do you think? And do you think, for example, that Hobbes might have thought, and Locke might have thought, and Descartes, that they had seen something that no one else had ever seen, and that this was a kind of indication of their superiority intellectually?
Yes. So all of them is very, very explicit in Bacon and Descartes, who read the sixth part of the Discourse on Method, where he basically makes the research proposal for the Enlightenment. And it is that I will produce the science, the method of, to use Bacon's phrase, the method of methods, right? The scientific methodology by which various scientific disciplines will develop to provide you with an increase in goods and infinite artifacts by which to conquer the earth and so on. So, and in exchange for that, he will have eternal fame. So whereas, Plato was saying that there's three desires in the human psyche: the desire for wisdom, the desire for honor, and the desire for pleasure or the bodily desires. So the moderns just cut off the top one. There's no desire for contemplation in and of itself, right? Because reason is an instrument. You don't contemplate your toothbrush. What you want are the results of the toothbrush, shiny teeth. And so now the peak is honor or glory. And the moderns make various arguments about honor or glory to the following effect. Genuine honor or glory is for someone whose actions have been genuinely beneficial for everyone and not just a few people. So whereas Machiavelli says, look, I'm afraid there are no moral principles. You have to do what preserves your estate if you're a prince, and then ultimately the republic if you're a republic. But the early moderns universalize this to all of humankind, and that's why Bacon says things such as conquer the universe for the sake of humanity.
So do you think Leo Strauss or a student of Strauss twice removed, such as you, would believe that Aristotle, the classical authors like Aristotle, are still useful because when one of the moderns, you mentioned it 2 or 3 weeks ago, said, "Oh, look, this is all just fantasies. There has never been a place where these political writings of Plato and Aristotle have been effective. I guess Leo Strauss would say, well, that's not quite right. There have been places where they have been given, it's not purely fantasy. Leo Strauss admired the American Republic, I think, and Tocqueville as well. So would writers like that, so people who have been writing recently, say that, look, it's not purely fantasy, and it is possible to get a more or less, often, just 6 out of 10 achievement in history of the classical principles?
It's a large question. I'll give a slightly oblique answer, but one that directly addresses how we should think about this. Just democracy now. We can clearly see that there are some very just aspects to our society that come about through its construction on modern principles. I mean, the three influences on Australia are parliamentary democracy. It used to be Christianity, and the modern philosophical and scientific tradition. Now, I think we've virtually lost everything but the modern philosophical and scientific tradition in terms of our public discourse and our political life. And that's a problem, I think, because you can see that what that does to the discourse, which is impoverished by its not being able to appeal to a whole series of principles that are more substantial than economic freedom or economic justice, whatever it is that they're arguing about. Now, if we want to retain what is beneficial about a modern liberal democracy, such as Australia's, we're not going to do it on the basis of Hobbes and Locke, because that leads ultimately to nihilism, to Nietzsche. So what we need to do is to rethink the things that we find precious, such as there is, everyone should have certain rights that are unalienable and so on. But we're going to have to do that from an argument for specific human potential, specific human nature. And to do that, we have to go back to the classics. Now, Aristotle and Plato would very happily recognize the decency of a decent political regime. And Aristotle writes 2 books on how to improve all kinds of regimes, oligarchies, monarchies, and so on. And so his advice would be keep those things that are good and provide them with the proper foundation, which you don't currently have, because our intellectual life, after this long process from Hobbes to Nietzsche, has rejected the notion that there is any such thing as an intelligible end to human life. So the argument is about power, and the argument is about collectives and identities, and not human beings. And that hence much confusion and some injustice and some erosion of our attachment to our own principles. Is that suggestion at all helpful as an answer to? Okay. It's I haven't read.
What do the asterisks in the text signify?
There's actually a glossary at the back of this book, which I should have excerpted too, because some of them are quite helpful.
So they're words that are glossed in the book.
Yeah, it's just word. Yeah, yes.
Okay, that's fine.
Yeah. Okay, so he's made this argument for the equality of all human beings in body and soul. In body, because we have an equal chance of killing each other. We just have to gang up or form the appropriate plan. We're equal in soul because we all think that we are as wise as everyone else. Right, and now we continue with this discussion of human nature and its happiness. From this equality of ability, right? So that's an equality of ability. That's, I mean, it's yeah, okay, whatever you think of the argument, arises equality of hope in the attaining of our ends. And therefore, if any 2 men desire the same thing, which nevertheless they cannot both enjoy, they become enemies. And in the way to their end, which is principally their own conservation. So that's his argument. That's our main end. There's no positive end. We want to conserve ourselves, right? and sometimes their pleasure, their delectation only. So 2 men in such condition endeavor to destroy or subdue one another. So this is our nature. We have individual desires, and by nature we seek to fulfill them. And if anyone gets in the way, we'll kill them. From hence it comes to pass that, where an invader hath no more to fear than another man's single power, if one plant, that is, if one attempts to undertake agriculture, sow, build, or possess a convenient seat, others may probably be expected to come prepared with forces united to dispossess and deprive him, not only of the fruit of his labor, but also of his life or liberty. And if you reverse that, then what we want to protect is life, liberty, and the fruits of our labor. And the invader, again, is in the like danger of another. And from this diffidence, that is, fear of one another, there is no way for any man to secure himself so reasonable an anticipation, that is, by force or wiles to master the persons of all men he can, so long till he see no other power great enough to endanger him. And this is no more than his own conservation requires, and is generally allowed. Also, because there be some that taking pleasure in contemplating their own power in acts of conquest, which they pursue further than their security requires, if others, that otherwise will be glad to be at ease within modest bounds, should not by invasion increase their power, they would not be able, for a long time, by standing only on their defense, to subsist. So, first of all, we have competing, we compete over the things we desire for our conservation. And then others who are vain or take glory in their conquests become so ambitious that we are forced to compete against them. Yes. And by consequence, such augmentation of dominion over men being necessary to a man's conservation, it ought to be allowed him. So he's saying by nature, you can do anything you like to protect yourself, and you'll be forced to seek power over other people. So again, this is our nature. Again, men have no pleasure, but on the contrary, a great deal of grief in keeping company where there is no power able to overawe them all. There is no natural inclination for human fellowship. So contrast with Aristotle would be books 8 and 9 of the Ethics, which are on friendship. So the book on the practical, the moral virtues, which culminates in book 10 on the intellectual virtues, is split up by these 2 books on friendship, because that is absolutely central to human excellence, because there is a natural affection between human beings. Whereas Hobbes is starting from the opposite point of view. There's a natural hatred of the company of other human beings, because unless there's some power that can keep us all in check, we're in constant danger of losing our lives. Okay. For every man looks that his companion should value him at the same rate he sets upon himself, and upon all signs of contempt or undervaluing, naturally endeavours, as far as he dares, which amongst them that have no common power to keep them in quiet, is far enough to make them destroy another, to extort a greater value from his contemners by damage, and from others by the example. Okay, so no natural pleasure in one another's company, and everyone values himself first and wants others to value oneself at that same rank, and will kill others in order to get that to happen. Which is an unusually extreme example of what people do if they don't get enough likes on their Insta Telegram thing. Okay, so summary. So that in the nature of man, we find 3 principal causes of quarrel. First, competition over the same goods. Second, diffidence or fear that other people will take our goods. Third, glory. That is, wanting others to value us as we value ourselves. The first maketh men invade for gain, the second for safety, and the third for reputation. The first use violence to make themselves masters of other men's persons, wives, children, and cattle. The second, to defend them. The third, for trifles, as a word, a smile, a different opinion, and any other sign of undervalue, either direct or in their persons, or by reflection in their kindred, their friends, their nation, their profession, or their name. Hereby it is manifest that during the time men live without a common power to keep them in awe, they are in that condition which is called war. And such a war is of every man against every man. For war consisteth not in battle only, or the act of fighting, but in a tract of time wherein the will to contend by battle is sufficiently known. And therefore the notion of time is to be considered in the nature of war, as it is in the nature of weather. For as the nature of foul weather lieth not in a shower or two of rain, but in an inclination thereunto of many days together, so the nature of war consisteth not in actual fighting, but in the known disposition thereto during all the time there is no assurance to the contrary. All other time is peace, that is, when there is a common power that can prevent people from harming one another. And this is a famous paragraph in Hobbes. Whatsoever there is consequent to a time of war, where every man is enemy to every man, the same is consequent to the time wherein men live without other security than what their own strength and their own invention shall furnish them withal. In such condition, there is no place for industry, because the fruit thereof is uncertain, and consequently no culture of the earth, no navigation, nor use of the commodities that may be imported by sea, no commodious building, no instruments of moving and removing such things as require much force, no knowledge of the face of the earth, no account of time, no arts, no letters, no society, and, which is worst of all, continual fear and danger of violent death, and the life of man solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Now, I like the next sentence for its summary. It may seem strange to some man, say Aristotle, that has not well weighed these things, that nature should thus dissociate and render men apt to invade and destroy one another. So I'm going to come to a different, I'm going to go back to the handout for a moment. Okay, so that's the second contrast that I've suggested here. Nature dissociates, whereas for Aristotle, we're by nature the animal that comes through fruition in a political community. Now, for Aristotle and the tradition after him, that means there are by nature principles of justice, which are knowable. Whereas Hobbes, as I've got this section, is there natural right? Is there justice by nature? And Hobbes says, in the state of nature, nothing can be unjust. The notions of right and wrong, justice and injustice have no place. So by nature, there are no principles of justice. Now, Grotius has a summary of what up to that point in this tradition, which at that time had been synthesized with the Christian theological tradition, natural right meant. And so I've included this expression here, and Curley has it in his edition of Hobbes as well. Natural right is a dictate of right reason. So because there are natural principles of justice, they can be known by human reason and acted upon, rather than being whatever the law is that is imposed by the common power. Natural right is a dictate of right reason, indicating that some act is either morally necessary or morally shameful, because of his agreement or disagreement with man's nature as a rational and social being. Aristotle could have written that sentence. And consequently, that such an act is either commanded or forbidden by God, the author of nature. So that's the tradition that Hobbes is arguing against. That human beings are naturally political or naturally social, and that there are natural principles. And the fact that there are natural principles, just to repeat from what I was suggesting earlier, means that there's a standard outside any set of laws, and that causes the problems that Hobbes is trying to solve. Now, so are there natural laws? Now, in Aristotle, there are no natural laws. In Greek thought, nature is in opposition to law. There does develop a notion of natural law in Stoic thought, and then much more fully in medieval thought. We can we can discuss that in more detail, but just for the moment, on the point of natural law, which is similar to, but not the same as natural right. So Hobbes on natural law. So the natural law teaching that Aquinas has is very Aristotelian, that beings have a certain character and the natural law represents what the fulfillment of that character requires. And that is the virtues. He has more virtues, but it's a similar argument. But that means that always and everywhere there is the same principle. And that's a later expression of what Aristotle is saying about natural right. So he says, of political right, the one part is natural and the other conventional or lawful. It's the same meaning. Natural right has the same force everywhere, not because it is held by some city. So, yeah, what is by nature right is the same everywhere, whether or not anyone believes it, or whether or not anyone has laws in accord with it or against it. But conventional right, the lawful right, is that which makes no difference at the beginning, but makes a difference once you've made the law. For example, you can only drive at this speed here or whatever. So the things just not by nature, but human, that is human institutions or laws are not everywhere the same. So since the regimes are not either. So laws are an expression of the regime. But everywhere the one regime is best, that in accord with nature. Accord is normally spelled with an A, but the A on my keyboard has stuck for some reason. Okay, so Aristotle is not a relativist about justice. There is one regime in accord with nature everywhere, but you won't be able to bring that into being everywhere because peoples differ in different places by whether or not they're agricultural or herders or whatever it is. Whatever their history, their religions, and so on will differ, and therefore the character of the regime will depend in part upon the material that you're dealing with as a lawmaker or founder. But there's one standard that's true everywhere, and the regimes represent a more or less just reflection of that. So that's natural right. Hobbes says a law of nature is a precept or general rule found out by reason, by which a man is forbidden to do that which is destructive of his life or takes away the means to preserve his life. So he is going to argue that there are laws of nature, but that they're calculations based upon what would preserve you. And there's an interesting discussion of that at the beginning of chapter 14 here. So the right of nature, which writers commonly call jus naturale, is the liberty of each man have to use his own power as he wants, as he will himself, for the preservation of his own nature. That is to say, his life and whatever else that needs, in his judgment. So the right is fundamental, and obedience to the law is derivative from that. So by liberty is understood, according to the proper signification of the word, the absence of external impediments. And there are the only impediments you have by nature are those that are practical, that stand in the way of you conserving yourself, which are many, given that we're in a war of all against all. But the right of nature and the liberty to do anything whatsoever that you desire, including do whatever you wish to anyone else or their body, that's fundamental. A law of nature is a precept or general rule found out by reason, by which man is forbidden to do that which is destructive of his life, as I read before. So therefore, a reason is it's a calculation. And then he calls this the first and fundamental law of nature, which is seek peace and follow it. And seek peace by making a contract with other human beings who are equally at danger as oneself. And we appoint a ruler, whether one person or many people, so a monarch or a parliament, and then they rule us and enforce our rights to be free of violent death. Now, that's Hobbes, and I've neglected Locke and Rousseau. I'll just make a couple of quick points. So Rousseau sorry, Locke. Locke says, first of all, we have property. Yeah, I'll just summarize some of these things and we can discuss. So Locke's claim is we first of all have property and total right in our own body. Now, unlike Hobbes, he's going to argue that we can legitimately have property in the state of nature, and that is by adding any of our labor to it, whether it's just picking an apple. If you picked an apple from a tree, that labor now makes that apple yours. If you sow corn, if you construct a house, you have mixed your labor with nature and given that nature, those natural materials, some value. And you now have the right of property to that. So therefore, the purpose of the political community is to preserve your property. And your first property is your body, and then anything you've mixed your labor with. Now, he continually says that, you know, you have the full right to anything that is natural. And by the way, this begins this understanding that nature is not of much worth. He begins by saying that human labor supplies perhaps 9/10 of the value of anything when you've made it. By the end of the second treatise on government, he said 1/10,000th of the value of the thing is the natural amount. So nature gets gradually discounted. And he uses this expression at one point: nature provides the almost worthless materials in themselves. And now this is, and you know, the later history of this, there's an expression in Heidegger's essay on technology where he says, you know, the modern thought tends to reduce nature to a standing reserve. And that's, I think, you know, he's talking about the same phenomena. We look at the rest of nature, there's no ends within it for ourselves to understand. And B, it's just the material, the resources. Of course, the next step, and Heidegger is aware of this, is that we turn human beings into resources. Obviously, human resource departments are, you know, you have your material resources and your human resources. And we're coming to a very extreme version of this understanding, with the notion that artificial intelligence will mingle with human intelligence and will all be controlled by an algorithm and so on. Which sounds mad, but it's taken seriously by some people. Now, so Locke is saying you mix your labor with the almost worthless materials that nature provides, and that's now yours. But he has this clause that he attaches to this statement, which is that as long as there is enough and as good for everyone else. Now, then he says there are some things that have no worth whatsoever for human life. Gold, diamonds, right? They're just shiny objects. So if we put a value on those objects, then we have consented to that value because they have no worth in themselves. It's merely an estimation agreed upon by people who use gold as a currency. And if you build up a pile of gold, you're not taking any apples or houses from anyone else. So you can accumulate as much gold as you want, and you will still leave as much of the actual goods of life as there were for everyone else. So by the end of this chapter 5 on property, he has argued that because we consent to the value of gold, we have therefore consented to the disproportionate ownership of property in society, and that is just. And so that's, you know, the thinking that is then developed by later economists and philosophers. Now, we've covered some distance, so yeah, if there's objections or questions, I'd be happy to discuss. Or we could look at Rousseau in 3 minutes, but yeah. Any points anyone would like to raise? Right.
Yeah, so I'll just, like, are you there, Martin?
Yep.
I think so. I think even Locke, I think even Karl Marx was more or less indebted to Locke for this idea of the mixture of labour with nature accounting for value. But it was interesting that you said, was it Locke who said at first it was 1/10 is labour, and then what 1/10 is nature, and then it reduced down to a very small amount. I mean, and you mentioning Nietzsche seemed to be not so much doubtful about that, but critical of that notion. But basically, it seems to me to be right, to be true. So, were you saying that you think that's wrong, or you think it's like a shame, shall we say? It's unfortunate.
Yeah, I don't find it. I find that whole cast of thought difficult to accept, because because that's a radically incomplete understanding of nature. Now, what this political project shares with the scientific project is that we see nature as matter moving in space, which doesn't have any inherent worth except insofar as we can manipulate it to ourselves, to be extremely blunt. Right? But I find that thought less plausible than the thought that what's fundamental in nature is the differences in kinds. And that gets us back to, well, what's the difference that makes humankind specific? And then what is the specific excellence of that kind? You can't do that if you make this first argument that nature in itself is homogeneous. And Bacon probably is the person who makes the most extensive argument for this in the New Organon, but that Descartes also makes that argument, that the nature in and of itself is that matter measurable by mathematics, which is homogeneous. And he does that famous experiment in the Meditations where he says, imagine a ball of wax. It has a certain hardness, smell. You can tap it, and if you melt it, it's the same wax. Everyone would say it's the same wax, but now it has a completely different motion, a different smell, different fluidity. So therefore, and that's his model for matter. Now you only have to substitute for that a cat or an apple, and you can see it doesn't work, right? It only works with wax. Now he's aware of this. He's trying to make an argument that fundamentally what matters is the material, not the species-specific character of things. Whereas I find that whole argument persuasive only as an instrument to providing certain kinds of goods. And Descartes' response is, yes, I'm making that argument in order to develop the instrument to bring about certain kinds of goods for human beings. Now, the problem is as follows. Nature gives us no ends. And Descartes and Bacon and Hobbes want to supply the means to certain very common ends, very powerful ends: avoidance of violent death, agriculture, medicine. We want to make these things advance so we can live longer and healthier lives. That's powerful and broad. But then other people will say, but you have no reason for that end. And they don't, because reason is an instrument to that end. And so they will say, Rousseau will say, that's contemptible. You're just a bunch of shopkeepers calculating about how to live. You'll always be false to yourself, and you'll be false to everyone else, because you're always trying to sell your piece of fish for a slightly higher price than the next person. And so he therefore, on this basis that we're naturally free and equal, tries to resurrect the classical political community, but now it becomes even more extreme, the degree to which we must be one in thought And that's where this notion of culture replaces the notion of civilization. I will just, since we've reached the end, of the lawgiver. Anyone who dares to institute a people must feel capable of, so to speak, changing human nature, of transforming each individual who by himself is a perfect and solitary whole into part of a larger whole from which that individual would, as it were, receive his life and being, of weakening man's constitution in order to strengthen it. And then further down, the more these natural forces are dead and destroyed, the greater and more lasting are the acquired ones. And the more solid and lasting also is the institution.
So this is Machiavelli, right?
No, that's this is Rousseau.
Oh, this is Rousseau. Okay.
Yeah. So okay.
Martin, does the Lockean notion of, the minimal contribution of nature lead you on eventually to notions of a just price, a just wage?
I'm not sure it wouldn't lead you to there being like a free market price. And so the person who says, no, there's a just price, there's an inherently just price, would be arguing against that.
Yeah. That gets you into economics and the whole theory of value.
Yes.
Subjective versus objective.
Right. There's just one phrase that I want to introduce you to very quickly before we stop. Okay. Okay, so this paragraph 8, hence for the social compact not to be an empty formula, it tacitly includes the following engagement which alone can give force to the rest, that whoever refuses to obey the general will shall be constrained to do so by the entire body, which means nothing other than that he shall be forced to be free. So if you say that as a human being, you cannot replicate your freedom in the state of nature unless you are wholly a part of a small, highly unified body, then you can be forced to be free, which I regard as a paradoxical phrase, as I'm sure he's aware. So Rousseau gives birth to a whole lot of different, whole literary, philosophical movements. And one of them is Romanticism and the romantic novel. Jane Austen is the heir of Rousseau. Tolstoy is one of the great direct heirs. He's very Rousseauian in his whole outlook. Just read Anna Karenina is like the peak example of someone who puts the marriage bond at the peak, at the center of human life, and the cosmos rebels if that's overthrown, despite the fact that Anna Karenina is in an unhappy marriage, and so on. But also he's responsible for this, some radical political traditions that want a collection with total solidarity. I think didn't they bring his body back to Paris after the revolution? That's my vague memory of reading some of the history. Okay, we should come to a close. I'm sorry, that's 5 past. I apologize. So yeah, thank you for your attention. Happy to